Strategic competition with China. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm Senior Vice President here and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and we're delighted to have you all here for what I am sure will be a very illuminating discussion on the current trajectory of U.S. strategy towards China, featuring Dr. Michael Pillsbury, Mr. Jim Sciutto, and Ambassador Paula J. Dobriansky. Today's event has been organized by the Scowcroft Center's Asia Security Initiative, and I think the topic of our discussion aligns really dead center with the mission of the Scowcroft Center as a whole, where we work to honor General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embody his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the security of the United States, working in close cooperation with U.S. allies and partners on the most important strategic challenges. And to me, this set of questions is the strategic challenge of our time. There really are very few competitors to that. And so in keeping with this mission, we've been closely monitoring developments and long-term trends in U.S.-China relations as we seek to answer enduring questions about the effectiveness of U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific, coordination with allies to respond to and help manage China's rise, and the role that strategic competition as well as strategic cooperation will play in shaping a rules-based international order in the decades to come. In our growing work on China, we develop concrete policy recommendations on traditional security issues, including cross-straits relations, the importance of U.S. allies in the region to China's role in issues like North Korean denuclearization and other matters. But at the same time, we're increasingly examining the critical role and issues associated with non-traditional areas, including the long-term effects of changing regional economic architectures, and as you might expect, a lot of new work on the impact of emerging technologies that are just playing out on the strategic landscape of the region, but also of the world across pretty much every continent in which the United States and China engage. Considering the books written by today's panelists, today's discussion will touch on many of these issues, and I very much look forward to hearing our panelists' insights and analysis at this really important period in the history of this important set of issues. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that this event will be webcast live and on the record. Please join us in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ACAsia, and from the Atlanta Council's account, that is at AC Scowcroft. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Ambassador Paula J. Dobriansky. Ambassador Dobriansky is the former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, a senior fellow in the Future of Diplomacy Project at Harvard University's JFK Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, a board director here at the Atlanta Council, and most importantly, the new vice chair of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. We're very fortunate to have her here today to moderate this discussion, and this discussion was also instigated and arranged by Ambassador Dobriansky. Ambassador Dobriansky will introduce our two panelists. So at this time, I'd like to invite all three of them to the stage to begin our discussion.
It's okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Barry. We're delighted to be here this afternoon, and we're going to dive right in. I want to, however, just give a brief introduction of these two distinguished gentlemen. We're going to hear from first Dr. Michael Pillsbury, who's had a distinguished career in the Pentagon and also as an author. He is the Senior Fellow and Director for Chinese Strategy at the Hudson Institute and author of The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. He's also a co-author of a forthcoming book entitled China and the West, The Monk Debates. And also, because we are here at the Atlanta Council, I do want to reference, you've had an affiliation here with the Atlanta Council. You were a senior fellow here from 1995 to 96. So welcome back. We're very delighted to have Jim Sciutto, who's well known to many of you, anchor and chief national security correspondent at CNN, and author of a new book, The Shadow War: Inside Russia's and China's Secret Operations to Defeat America. I want to mention a few things about his background that you might not know. He has spent considerable time in the region with your journalist hat on one hand in a number of countries, not just only in China, but around there, Laos, Korea, Singapore, among others. And then also he has a, if I could use the term, a diplomatic background and stint. He served as the chief of staff to Ambassador Gary Locke at a challenging time in Beijing and looking at our relationship in Beijing. I'm very delighted that both of them could be here this afternoon. And what we'd like to do is, I'm going to begin with you, Dr. Pillsbury. If you could address the topic for about 5 minutes, a brief view of what is uppermost on your mind in terms of this strategic competition, the United States and its strategic competition with China? What would you want this audience to know? And after you, then we'll hear from Jim.
Well, thank you, Paula. I'm a fan of Jim's book. It's very vivid. My book is more of a history of the last 40 years U.S.-China relations. I think the most important thing I'd like to share today is my impression of what President Trump is doing with China and about China. I think he's been very harshly criticized by people who think they know what his China policy is, but I think their assessment is not accurate. There's a couple of letters that have been made public this month. One is by 100 China experts or former officials, and it characterizes President Trump's policy toward China as seeing China as an enemy. Uses the word enemy a couple times, and it says this is very bad, counterproductive, I think is the word they use. It's published in the Washington Post. I think it's not correct. I have a collection myself of more than 200 documents, speeches, articles, reports, and tweets by the Trump administration, including the president. Not once has any Trump administration official used the word enemy. On the contrary, the president's spoken a lot about, and quite fondly, of his personal relationship with President Xi on hot-button issues like Hong Kong. If the president was going to treat China in an adversarial way, he would certainly say something to endorse these demonstrations in Hong Kong. Actually, he said the opposite. On Taiwan arms sales, under the Obama administration, there was a letter, Paula, from 47 U.S. senators about F-16 sales for Taiwan. The confirmation of the Deputy Secretary of State was held up by these senators until President Obama agreed to at least talk with the Senate about the F-16s for Taiwan. Taiwan's previous President Ma joked one time at a press conference he'd asked more than a dozen times for the F-16s, about 60 F-16s to be sold. Hawks who want to put pressure on China focus on arms sales to Taiwan is the number one way to compete with China, to arm Taiwan, or to give Taiwan more diplomatic space. President Trump has done neither of those things. He has not tried to help Taiwan gain additional diplomatic recognition in the world, and he's not sold the F-16s. There's a list of other matters. The Dalai Lama used to be a very hot topic issue. President Obama at least received him, but then the White House released a photo of the Dalai Lama walking out in the snow next to some black plastic trash bags. White House official photo release. President Trump has not invited the Dalai Lama. So you see the letter of July 3rd by the 100 China experts upsets me so much, because what this does in Beijing is gives fuel to the emotions of the hawks, which is what my book is mainly about, the hawk point of view in China. It makes them say, aha, well, President Trump says he's not our enemy, but these 100 China experts say he is. So this also takes the focus away from what to me is the main competition between the US and China. And that is something initiated a long time ago by the Democratic Party, especially in the Congress. It's unfair trade practices, technology theft, tolerating subsidies, allowing China into the WTO, which, by the way, Nancy Pelosi opposed, China joining the WTO, and Bob Lighthizer, our current USTR and main negotiator with China, also opposed it. So this area of trade, unfair practices, non-trade barriers, technology theft, this is the main focus of the competition. But what happens when people, dare I say it, Paula, if they demonize President Trump's views, or if they focus on the views of Steve Bannon, who's been out of office now almost 2 years, then they get a false perception of what President Trump is trying to do. To me, this is not just a small error among scholars and think tanks and retired officials. This is a tragedy, because if it fuels nationalistic fervor in Beijing, that America treats us as an enemy, the answer obviously is for China to adopt a much harsher policy toward the United States. And there's a number of things they can do that they have not done, but that they could do. So as Graham Allison's pointed out in his book, Destined for War, as Henry Kissinger pointed out in his book on China, the possibility of a descent into war does exist. This wasn't the case back in the 1980s, that some like former Ambassador Jim Lilly referred to as the golden age in US-China relations. There was no talk then of a possible war. Both sides actually reduced their military deployments against each other. But that is something to hold out when you talk about strategic competition, our topic for today, between the US and China. My proposal is we try to put limits on it. Let's compete where we should compete. Let's not tolerate unfair advantages on the Chinese side. And let's be tough. Let's walk out of trade talks if we have to. As the president has said, maybe there'll be no deal. He's also said he's not in a hurry for a deal. He also rejected the reneging that China engaged in within 24 hours of when it happened. So to me, the competition in trade, economics, is best encapsulated in a phrase I've heard the president say several times now. At first it was just in-house, now he said it in public. It's a little partisan for the bipartisan Atlantic Council, but I better say it anyway. He says if Hillary Clinton had won, China would have surpassed America by now, or during her term. Sometimes he puts it. Then he adds, I think with a wink in his eye, it's not going to happen on my watch. This is what's at stake in the strategic competition. I use the word primacy, or being world leader. Frankly, I don't like the Chinese vision of the New World Order that they've put forward in a number of academic articles, that they will write the rules in the future. A lot of what Belt and Road Initiative is doing, and they intend to globalize when and if they are number one in the world. What President Trump seems to see as the competition is denying China forever the primacy of being the world leader. The Chinese response to that is very clever. They say, no, we have no such goal. Dr. Pillsbury's book is wrong. We do not seek to replace America. We only want to feed our poor people. We want to get our per capita income, which is number 90 or so in the world. We want to get it up to be much higher. And of course, because there's 4 times more Chinese than there are Americans, when we just get to 1/4 of your per capita GDP, we'll equal your economy accidentally. When we get to half of your per capita GDP, our economy will be double yours, which they expect to do by about 2030. And a couple of their economists, really top economists, one of whom was a chief economist for the World Bank before he went back to Beijing, they say by 2049, which is what my book, The 100-Year Marathon, is about, they say by 2049 we'll be triple or more the size of the US economy. So in some sense, under those conditions, they will own us. We'll be a kind of a colony of China. And we'll have a lot of Americans all along the way who say, well, we were in an immoral country, we had slavery, we had all kinds of violations of people's rights. We had our chance to be number one. Let China take over the world. That point of view is very strong in our country. I hope we don't see that happen, because my hunch is, with those kind of economic growth rates, it's only going to happen once when China surpasses us. There's not going to be a rematch or a second running of the 100-year marathon. That, I think, is what the strategic competition is about.
All right. Jim, let's hear from you. And by the way, let me add one other thing I wanted to mention that I found very interesting in your background. I mentioned your time you were chief of staff at the embassy, but also you were a Fulbright scholar as well in the region. So you've had multiple ties in. And also, for the record, Atlantic Council is nonpartisan. Jim, over to you.
Nonpartisan.
Nonpartisan.
Okay.
We say
Good
nonpartisan.
correction. Good
Am I
correction.
right? The staff here, nonpartisan.
I'm not sure I know the difference.
Okay.
No, I'm glad you mentioned Fulbright, because I have this great debt to the Fulbright program, because it, in effect, initiated my travels around the world, my education around the world, and it was my first time my first opportunity to spend time in China and spend time in the region. You know, it struck me as I read your book and listened to your summary of it, that here you have someone who advises President Trump on China policy, and you have a guy from CNN. And if you read our books, our laying out of China's ambitions are very similar. Very much indeed. And you know, nonpartisan. I think that it's a nonpartisan view of this problem, and then the question is how do you approach it? Just to be, I agree with many of the things that Dr. Pillsbury said about China's ambitions. Just expand on that if I can, because that's really the intention of the book. Is what I try to do here is lay out for people the many fronts of this competition between the U.S. and China, and Russia, by the way, but let's focus on China today. Some of those fronts, my impression is people are aware of. They're aware of interference, say, in elections, influence operations, which by the way, China does, perhaps in different ways than Russia, but it does as well. But there are other fronts that aren't talked about to the degree that I think they need to be, and I think that most Americans don't connect the dots on these fronts, how they fit into a bigger strategy by China to surpass the U.S. So you have the influence ops, election interference. There is already a space front in this competition. China and Russia have deployed offensive weapons in space. Let's talk about China's. There are kinetic kill vehicles in space that could take out satellites. China has innovated a what U.S. Space Command calls a kidnapper satellite that has a grappling arm that can pluck satellites out of orbit to blind the U.S. military and also disable civilian technologies that we depend on. China knows that we are more advanced in space, therefore more dependent in space, and therefore in the event of a war, this is absolutely a front, but also short of an all-out war, there are ways to dazzle, to blind, to temporarily disable satellite capabilities that we depend on. So influence ops, elections. Space war, there is a competition under the waves. For the book, I take you under the Arctic, where U.S. nuclear submarines, and I got to spend my birthday on one of those a couple of years ago, or last year actually. Not a bad place for me to spend your birthday. Where U.S. subs are training with greater urgency now to keep up with the advances that both Russia and China have made in submarine capabilities. China, in particular, diesel-electric submarines, they're quieter. Many of folks in this room will remember how nervous the U.S. Navy got when one of those submarines popped up unannounced in the midst of a U.S. carrier group. They won't say that they didn't know they were coming, but it's believed they didn't know that they were there. That's another front, under the waves. Then you have good old-fashioned 19th century land grabs, still happening today. Russia did it in Ukraine. China puts a new twist on it. Let's just create some new territory in the South China Sea. I got to spend some time on a U.S. P-8 Poseidon surveillance flight a couple of years ago over the man-made islands in the South China Sea in the midst of the most rapid phase of the development there, where they were adding hundreds of football fields of territory over the course of a couple of months. We flew over Fiery Cross Reef. I mean, you know some of these names. As we saw 20 some odd dredgers just digging up a harbor while you're creating the land. And of course, during that time, China made assurances to the Obama administration they would not militarize, assurances that we accepted. China has since militarized those, and you got runways long enough to accommodate every aircraft in the Chinese Air Force. You have them doing, in recent weeks, surface-to-air missile tests on those islands. They've got hardened bunkers, et cetera. They have militarized, they're there, they're not going anywhere. So what I try to do in the book is connect all of those fronts. And of course, there is a trade aspect to it, which is significant. There's a chapter in there, which is just one small piece, but I think illustrates the success of China's efforts to steal U.S. intellectual property. I focus on one guy, Stephen Su, who over the course of 4 years with 2 partners in China stole hundreds of gigabytes of data on 3 of our most sensitive and advanced military aircraft, the F-35, F-22, C-17. Today, you can Google the pictures. China is flying aircraft that look very much like the F-35, the F-22, and the C-17. I don't want to exaggerate that they have all the capabilities, but they certainly stole very successfully a lot of those capabilities. It works. I speak for the purposes of that chapter to Bob Anderson, who used to do counter intel for the FBI, and I asked him how many of these operations is the FBI, is the U.S. aware of at any given time? And he said, I'd feel good if we knew of about 10%, 1 in 10. And that means you have a lot of other Su-bins running out there. And he says as the technology advances, you don't even really need a guy on the ground here to identify the targets to be stolen from afar. That's what I try to do in this book. I will say that like Dr. Pillsbury, and also woven in here, is the breadth of China's plans to surpass the U.S., and they've talked about it very publicly since 1949. It's in their strategy, secure the Han-dominated areas, go out to Xinjiang and Tibet, go to the first island chain, the second island chain, the near seas, the far seas, and they've been carrying this out systematically and doing it with great success over time. And the sad fact is that administrations of both parties through the years have missed China's intentions and misread them. A word that came up repeatedly from the many former senior officials and current officials that I spoke to for the book is mirroring. That we mirrored, we looked at them and thought they wanted what we want, and in fact they don't. And I benefit from self-critical analysis from these folks who say, listen, I was serving in those administrations, Democrat and Republican, and we missed it. And now they're coming around to seeing what we have to do. That's my brief synopsis of the book, and I know we have a lot of good questions coming from you.
Let me start with you, and then same question for you. Can we be strategic competitors, and at the same time, can we have strategic cooperation with China in a variety of areas? And if so, what would be those areas that you think would be most significant and helpful to the relationship?
Short answer is yes. The final chapter of the book, I asked a lot of these folks who've been with developing U.S. policy in China, both military, national security, diplomatic strategy, and I try to lay out solutions to this. But there are ways to approach China, setting firm red lines, keeping those red lines, raising the costs for behaviors that are damaging to your interests, knowing the enemy. These are not brand new ideas with dealing with adversaries or with a rising power. And frankly, they make similar recommendations for dealing with Russia, which of course is a declining power, but is presenting threats in different ways. So yes, there is. I worry personally that in the midst of the current trade war, that there will be a decoupling that hurts both sides. If you listen to folks like Jack Ma, they will make the point that this trade war is not going to last a couple of years, it's going to last decades, that we have reoriented the relationship, and that just as we've both won to some degree, the U.S. has given up a lot in this relationship, but we've also benefited from it. Just as we both had some benefits from this relationship, we would both suffer in many ways if we allow these two planets to just decouple entirely. I worry about that. Yes, there is cooperation, and also there's enormous incentive to avoid the war you don't want, right? You know, as you get involved in areas and with increased nationalism and ambition and military hardware and capability, where do you clash? I mean, is it over South Korea when your ally fires 350 shots at a Russian and Chinese aircraft coming in? I mean, you know, you have incidents like this every couple of weeks, and in this environment, the danger of those escalating is severe.
How do you see it? What would be your response to that?
Well, I think
strategic competitors, but what about strategic cooperation?
I think everybody who's sane believes in a combination of competition and cooperation. The problem now is that the default position of our government is toward cooperation. There's almost no competition. And I argue in one of the chapters of 100-Year Marathon, I explain why this is. When Jimmy Carter recognized China and we exchanged embassies, he issued a directive to all departments of the government, all 15 big departments. And that directive is still in force. The departments are all ordered to cooperate, to find a Chinese counterpart and to cooperate with that counterpart. In many cases, a commission was formed, let's say between Treasury and Commerce. On both sides found their Chinese counterparts. EPA, we helped create an EPA in China. Defense Department cooperation began. Really extensive military exchanges, weapons sales, $500 million worth of weapons sales in the 80s. Department by department, the order was cooperate with China. There's actually never been an order from any president to compete with China. So if you're a federal bureaucrat at any of the great departments, or you're in the embassy in Beijing where Jim worked, we have 2,300 employees in our embassy in Beijing. According to the embassy website, approximately 50 agencies are represented in our embassy. Think about this now. Each one assigned to cooperate and help and assist their counterparts. This has gone very, very far. I once went to the main Chinese aircraft factory in Shanghai. And I said, why are you getting so much progress? How come your standards are so high? You just started making airliners. Oh, we have 4 FAA officials here in our factory, and they're helping us build better airliners. I said, that can't be. And they said, oh, you can come meet them. They're right over here. And they explained to me in their minds, they were there to make sure these Chinese airliners were safe, because we all want global aviation safety, right? Well, does that mean we're competing in the production of airliners? No. What is not being handed over directly, the Chinese can also steal and have done so. So in airliner manufacturing, we're still number 1, but they're growing rapidly. There's a long list like this. Now, I've told members of Congress, you gentlemen and ladies never approved this. You never even saw the Jimmy Carter directive. Each department that does these activities does so usually under its international affairs budget, which no one ever examines. And it gets almost comical. One time there was a book about the coming collapse of China because they had so many non-performing loans. What did the United States government do? Applaud and say, yeah, too bad, we're going to pull ahead now because our banking system works really well and yours doesn't. No, the controller of the currency and the Treasury Department sent teams to Chinese major banks to teach them how to reduce non-performing loans and to have better standards for when you make a loan. If you read Hank Paulson's really excellent book, Dealing with China, it tells how he proposes to China's premier in many meetings, you guys need to bring all your little cell phone companies together. You could have the world's biggest telecom company. And for Goldman Sachs, I will float this on Wall Street for you, and you can have $5 or $6 billion. According to Hank Paulson's account, the Chinese premier was astonished. You, an American capitalist country, would put together our phone companies, including government-controlled companies, and sell the whole thing and get $5 billion for us to spend? and make us the world's biggest telecommunications power? And Hank Paulson says, yes. But then he adds, because he's competitive about one thing, he says, be sure you don't work with Morgan Stanley. And the Chinese say, well, why not? They say, because they will do it very poorly, they won't value it the right way, and all this came true. Chinese companies used to have 0 on the Fortune 500 list of the biggest capitalized countries in the world. Today, it's over 100. It's over 100. The world's biggest banks, are they all up in New York? No. The 5 biggest banks in the world are in China. So this has gone very far. This American government assistance setting the atmosphere that we have to help our poor Chinese brothers and sisters, then our private sector picking up the opportunity. So how to undo this? I'm not so much worried about cooperation being eclipsed or reduced. I'm worried about cooperation is still about 95% of what we do, and very little competition.
Let me ask you about the trade deal, because that's right before us. What do you see? Let's start with you on this one, and we'll work backwards. We'll go each way each time.
CNN reporter, ready to go.
But I'm asking you. I'm asking you first. Okay. So what do you think is going to be the outcome here? You had a piece about a month ago in the Wall Street Journal, which focused on the tariffs. You indicated that the tariffs would be a very good strategy of incentive for the immediate term, you mentioned, not per se for the long term, but for the immediate term. But where do you see this going? Are we going to get do you think we're going to get a trade deal? That's my question to you, and then we'll go to you, Jim.
Well, I support the president, and he himself has said he doesn't know if we're going to get a trade deal or not. Negotiations obviously went very far. I think he's a hero for the way he started these negotiations. By the way, they were not part of the first few months. There was a total change in the framework by which we conduct U.S.-China relations, which was not well reported. It took place in April of 2017 at Mar-a-Lago, where the Chinese said, why don't we terminate the security and economic dialogue, where half of our cabinet gets together with half of your cabinet every 6 months or so. So they're non-productive. Let's create 4 new dialogue mechanisms, 2+2 cabinet ministers, and let's run trade issues through one of those 2+2 cabinet minister dialogues. That's how it started. They could not even reach agreement on a final statement to the press that they'd met. Those talks broke down. That led to the harsher approach of threats and tariffs and harsh language on both sides, most recently over China's reneging on large parts of the deal. But you'll notice during this whole period, what is happening? Are people walking out in a huff and saying, you monster, I'm not talking with you? No. Both sides seem to know we have to make a deal. The two sides are engaging in tactics that the president has written about in his famous classic, The Art of the Deal. Bringing up side issues, exchanging prices. So ultimately, will this lead to a deal? If the President of the United States says he doesn't know, I think that's right. Okay. On the Chinese side, they have turned nasty in the last couple of months. You can date it all back to about May 1st, when they reneged, and they began putting out a new line in the Chinese propaganda machinery. They began saying, the Americans started this trade war. It's not China's fault. They began to deny all the allegations, Jim, of technology theft, forcible transfer, everything that had been alleged in these long reports USTR put out. They said that's all false. Or in a moment of humor, one senior Chinese official told me, all those allegations against Chinese for theft, it's fake news.
Where'd that phrase come from?
So the two sides are shadow boxing. They seem to know ultimately what a deal would look like. A deal would have some kind of enforcement mechanism by which either side could accuse the other of breaking the deal. And then there would be tariffs or other kinds of punishment. But that's where the talks seem to have broken down over enforcement.
Jim, take it from the Chinese side. I mean, and I say that because in your book, and you've mentioned it in opening, the importance of technologies, what they're doing in that area, and that's a key component here. I mean, the kind of predatory actions that have taken place, intellectual property issues. What do you think? Do you think there's going to be an incentive from their side to conclude this deal?
So
How do
my
you see it?
question, and I've asked Dr. Pillsbury this before, is has Trump in effect backed China into a corner where it's difficult for them to make concessions? You know, has the baseball bat been swung so aggressively because, and again, we talked about this earlier, that I'll often say China is not a democracy by any means, but it has internal politics, and Xi cannot be seen to be kowtowing to the U.S. president and making concessions that either appear humiliating or not in Chinese interests. Is the U.S. position so aggressive as to push China over here where you can't get back to the middle where you have common ground? Open question. I know that President Trump, in negotiations, whether on the Hill or elsewhere, will often push that hard and then pull back. Right? Again, art of the deal. Is that possible with China, knowing the pride, the nationalism, the internal pressures not to be seen to be backing down to the U.S.? That's from China's side. On the U.S. side, one thing that strikes me from speaking to the administration on the trade negotiations is that there's some internal division here, that you have a Navarro, Lighthizer camp, and then you have a Mnuchin camp, and the concern from the Navarro side might be that, and this is just my perception, will they give up too much? We have to hold the line here, and others saying, well, listen, we have to find. I'm curious if you think that's accurate, that you have some that might be willing to bend a little bit more, and others who want to hold the line.
Okay, but thank you for putting it in a context of where things are. But would you like to comment on that?
I think both sides have a trick up their sleeves about their internal politics. And that is, when you want to take care of somebody whose opinion is not yours, you try to exclude them from the meeting. So we've seen a number of articles over the last year or so about excluding Peter Navarro, that he's not going to Buenos Aires. And then all of a sudden, at the last minute, he is going to Buenos Aires and he's on Air Force One. On the Chinese side, a very similar thing has been happening. The 30 delegates from the Chinese side, in my personal opinion, did not have any hawks among them. They had either technicians or people who were, I would call, reformers. Liu He himself is a very famous economist in China. He helped create something called the Club of 50. It's 50 economists. They have a kind of an agenda, which is major reforms, which would solve the problems President Trump's talking about. They're against subsidies. They're against the grand national champions. They're against a number of things that the Chinese economy has been structured to do. If there's no hawks at all in the Chinese delegation, then who is reporting to President Xi with a kind of a nationalistic point of view? There's nobody there. And maybe the commerce minister finding out in mid-April, and Ambassador Yu being recalled from Geneva and reading the agreements, maybe the two of them and other more hawkish people said, "Hey, you can't agree to this. This is terrible. You're giving away the store to President Trump." Maybe that's why they reneged. So for me, it's very good news, and Bloomberg reported it this afternoon. It's very good news that Commerce Minister Zhong Shan is going to join the delegation. He's been part of the last two phone calls. So you might think, well, having Navarro there, that's really bad for the American side. Why can't we let the moderates be in charge? And the answer is because President Trump's base would get angry at a bad deal. And the president said, I'm not going to have a bad deal. On Xi Jinping's side, he is involved in a political debate that helped him become the leader of China back in 2010, 2011. He began to move more toward the hawk position. It's one reason I wrote 100-Year Marathon, is to give the names and the positions of the hawks and what they think. They can't just be wished away in China. So he is adding Commerce Minister Zhong Shan to the talks, I think is a good thing. Now we're going to have a much better chance of reaching a deal that won't be reneged on or won't lead to years and years of enforcement disputes.
I have a few more questions, and then I'm going to be coming to all of you, so we have an interactive here. But let me go back to you, Jim. You mentioned your time in the Arctic. I myself, I had the privilege of going up to the Arctic, to Svalbard, and actually visited the Chinese science facility there. But the question that I want to ask, and not only related to the Arctic, but looking at Russia and the relationship of Russia and China, and let me explain why. How would you characterize the current relationship? And why I mention the Arctic specifically is because if you look at Russian military writings, the biggest concern that the Russians have, not about the United States, but it's about what China is doing in the Arctic. China is an observer of the Arctic Council, and it's keenly engaged in what's happening in the Arctic. So, broad question first of how would you characterize the relationship between Russia and China today? Is it a marriage of convenience? Is it more? Is it deeper? And then maybe translated to the information you shared with us about your own experience. What are you observing in the context of the Arctic itself?
So first on Russia, China, my view, and again, generally what I heard in researching the book is that it's a relationship of convenience, that they both have their own very singular ambitions to right what they see as wrongs and assume what they see as their rightful positions. China, the Middle Kingdom, reassuming its role as at the middle of the universe, as it were, and Russia righting the wrong of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And it's always struck me as interesting that in Beijing, Chinese leaders studied the collapse of the Soviet Union very closely with a view to that ain't going to be us, right? And they see that. So my sense is that they both have very singular ambitions, and in areas of overlap, more than happy to jointly stick their finger in the eye of the U.S. where possible, because they both have a shared goal of undermining the U.S. and Western institutions, which they see as skewed against them. And I've watched with great interest these incidents in the last few weeks where you've seen, I mean, listen, to have Russian and Chinese jets over South Korea challenging the airspace and getting shot at, no small thing. Month before, Russian destroyer buzzing a U.S. cruiser while she was meeting Putin. That struck me as very interesting as well. But as you note, they have areas where Russia rather is very concerned about China's dominance in the eastern part of Russia, much greater population, they're worried about that, and then of course in the Arctic. Okay, the Arctic, the ice is shrinking, global warming's real. Ask the U.S. Navy what they think about it. They're preparing for it. That opens up trade routes. It also opens up what's presumed to be great natural resources under there. So you have, so there's an economic incentive for Russia, China, and the U.S. to be capable there and present. New trade routes opening up there, but also another great game, as it were, in terms of military conflict and competition in a new front there, and submarines are central to that. Submarine capability is central to that, particularly for the U.S. By the way, you've probably seen this. Russia has 50 some odd icebreakers. We don't have. We got one. I think one or two, in the Coast Guard. So the subs are the tip of the spear there.
Right. How would you characterize the relationship between China and Russia?
Well, I can tell you what the president said when the trade delegation was in the Oval Office. He has a vision of three-way Russia, China, America arms control reductions. He said all three sides are spending too much on defense. And I think he's referring to, among other things, he's referring to the need, if we don't renew the so-called New START agreement with the Russians in a year, about 16 months or so, there will be no arms control agreements left in the world. We've already left CFE, we've left ABM, Missile Defense Treaty. The Chinese have not agreed to join these three-way talks. Congresswoman Liz Cheney and Senator Cruz actually have legislation, which got quite a few co-sponsors already, that the U.S. government should not renew the New START limits unless China is included and limits on the Chinese nuclear force are included. Chinese have surprised everybody. They've gone from 10 or 15 ICBMs focused on America to 75, according to the DoD recently. That's still nothing like the Russians. But a wildly growing Chinese nuclear force is a bad idea for us. Frankly, the larger picture is that we are 4 times the GDP of Russia. Russian GDP, not the old Soviet Union you and I worked on so long, but a really small GDP with a declining population, 4 times bigger. You can imagine what the Russian view is of a power on their border being 4 or 5 times bigger than they are. They actually talk about the fear of China turning Russia into a colony. There's an issue in the press for many years about how many undocumented aliens there are in Russia from China. Jim mentioned foreign influence operations of the Chinese. There's some evidence that there's influence operations even in Moscow and around Russia to make Russians think China is your friend, don't worry about our presence. So the challenge for any president is what to do about this new triangle. Remember, the word triangle used to be in the Cold War. I think it's reemerging now, where it's going to be to our benefit to have Russia and China be somewhat wary of each other for good reasons, for natural reasons, and for us to enjoy better relations with either of them than the two of them have with each other.
But how do you see the how do you see the Chinese how do they view the Russians at this stage from that perspective?
Well, there's a contradiction in the Chinese view of the Russians. On the one hand, they see the Russians as easy pickings. They write a lot about Russian resources, Russian hydropower. They've got a concept in China called comprehensive national power, which you can measure through various indicators, about 100 indicators. And they see the Russians as wealthy people who China, in the sense of resources, who China can exploit for China's own benefit. At the same time, they believe the Americans still have a kind of a Cold War mentality, fear of Russia. So China can get leverage on Washington, the more it can make it appear like we have Russia in our corner. Mm-hmm. So this is a problem with the Chinese view. And of course, as you know, on the Russian side, it's the same. The Russians have the feeling that China could be our quasi-ally and help us on the one hand. On the other hand, they're eating our lunch.
Just briefly, if I can,
Please.
on that, 'cause it brought up
Please,
two
please.
thoughts to me. One, prior to G20, got a briefing from the administration where they're making the case for a 3-way nuclear
Yes.
agreement. And one argument they make, which is reasonable, it's like, you renew this agreement, there are 6 weapons that have been developed since then that aren't covered by the agreement, so it's kind of useless in that sense.
Hypersonics.
Hypersonics for sure. And if you renew it with Russia, but you don't include China, that's in China's interest because, we would love to see you guys set limits while we do what we want. I mean, that's one point. It's fair. The other point I would make is this. So you're entering a world where you would lose your last nuclear missile treaty when, and this is another sort of quote-unquote solution, but focus is, we have no treaties for cyberspace or space where weapons are galore, and we're not even talking about sitting down.
No, we have a draft treaty under negotiation for outer space weapons limits. But the Chinese here have been very clever. They've said, well, we have to define weapons in outer space.
That's why
we say, no, that's very clear. A weapon is a weapon. Chinese say, no, anything in space that helps your American missile defense, even though it looks peaceful, that's a weapon. So the talks have gone nowhere for 10 years.
And it's why they call their kidnapper satellites a maintenance satellite, right? It's not a weapon. It's just a maintenance satellite. And it can also pluck garbage out of space. But
I think you're right. The arms race, the arms race in outer space is a very serious problem. And there are writings about the need for a surprise attack in the morning. There's several Chinese books now that talk about how do we beat the Americans. Americans have so many more weapon systems than we do. And several of them have talked about, they give them kind of a daily 6 a.m., we take out these American satellites, then the Americans can't do all this. Then 10 a.m. we do this. So they thought about preemptive strikes in space. And that was just academic, military think pieces, let's say 10 years ago. But now, as you mentioned, when they start doing these things, it's really quite striking. Gee, maybe the military books 10 years ago really meant it.
In the administration's national security strategy document, it does mention both Russia and China as being in strategic competition with us. It's interesting
And
some
each
of the
other.
developments that the Chinese, the relationship of the Chinese with Europe. And for example, the recent move by Italy to become part of the One Belt, One Road. How do you see this as, and again from not our perspective per se, but from Beijing's perspective, where does Europe fit into its calculations? And how does that affect our strategic competition with China?
I'm going to let him go first. He talks to the president.
No, I want you to go first so I can be on CNN on your show.
I will happily have you.
I would frame the question this way, Paula. I would say Europe is up for grabs.
Okay.
The two great superpowers now are America and China. Each of us has our advocates in Europe. We pretty much lost Greece. The Greeks are now voting against America in human rights votes. They've pretty much mortgaged their main port to China for 100 years. They have received a lot of loans they needed badly with no conditions on them, unlike Angela Merkel's loans that had massive conditions. The Greeks do something about their economics policy. The Chinese now have stepped in and said, no, don't worry about your economic policy. Here's the money. The Italian MOU to join the BRI, as you mentioned, that's another victory for China. And in Germany now, there's a bit of an awakening going on when China bought the biggest robotics company basically in the world from the Germans. This is very advanced technology. You think, well, why would China need robots? They have 1.4 billion people. Well, it turns out robots are a lot more productive and you can make more money if you have advanced robot technology. So the Chinese bought it when the Germans, because the Germans don't have any screening process to review national security problems when a foreign country buys a company.
CFIUS.
So they don't have a CFIUS. So recently the EU has put out these mysterious new words that hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. The EU document says that China is a systemic rival of the European Union. And they're not quite sure how to translate that into Mandarin, but they know it's not friendly. So to some degree, some of the European powers, the French certainly, the Dutch, to some degree, Boris Johnson I think will change this in Britain. They're starting to think about screening investments, continuing the arms sales embargo. It was put in place in 1989, 30 years ago. A lot of European companies and politicians want to lift that embargo. Billions of dollars of possible arms sales to China. They've had a number of reviews. Now I think the sentiment for keeping the arms sales embargo against China, I think the sentiment is growing. But the Chinese say you're just American puppets if you keep this embargo. It's not in the interests of Europe. So that's the metaphor I would use. Europe is up for grabs between Beijing and Washington. It's a much contested zone. And so far, I'd say the main European elected leaders are still with us. Values, putting Uyghurs in concentration camps. This sort of affects European thinking about China. But they have a massive influence operation all over Europe, that China is your friend. And President Xi in Davos 2.5 years ago, I think rather brilliantly, I give credit when the Chinese do something smart. President Xi gave a speech in Davos. First of all, why is he in Davos? He's a leader of a communist party. This is capitalism and corporations. He's there, and he says the worst thing in the world now is protectionism. China is against protectionism. By the way, it's called Guanbizhui. Guanbizhui. He said China is fighting against the global forces of protectionism, and then he let it out. It's America that's the leader of the forces to protect the world trade system. This is very bad. And a lot of Europeans are nodding their heads. Oh yeah, China good, Trump bad. So I wouldn't be complacent about the trends in the competition for Europe.
One of my curiosities is then, why doesn't the Trump administration calculate that it's in U.S. interests to be unified with Europe on these trade issues when they share the same concerns, right? To be fighting in effect on two fronts, fighting against the EU, antagonizing the EU, arguing the EU is on the same level really as China. And granted, I know there are loads of subsidies in Europe and trade restrictions, but they're not China. That's my curiosity. I wonder if you have, not to redirect here, but why is it in U.S. interest to divide rather than say, we're together on this, we stand by our EU partners against Chinese trade malpractice?
You're kind of usurping Paula's authority to ask questions.
Well,
your CNN,
actually, it's a
your
good
CNN self is
interactive.
taking over.
well, I can't resist
It's
sometimes.
a good interactive in my book. I
Well,
think it makes it more interesting.
I think I can.
By asking questions,
Yes.
it's making a statement.
Well, I'm responsive to you. I see you as the boss.
All right. Well, would you like to answer that
Answer his question.
Yes.
Okay, if you say so.
And then we're going to all of you.
No, the president has, as Donald J. Trump, from back in the 80s, he developed a view, and he's written about this in several of his 14 books. Donald J. Trump has written about the Allies freeloading on American defense spending. It's just a thing of his. He's not alone.
Talk about trade practice.
It was
here.
a huge problem for a long time, beginning back with President Eisenhower, actually, that the Europeans would not create the number of divisions that they promised. They promised 52 divisions, something called the Lisbon Treaty in 1952. They never did it. So he absorbed this criticism, and it's part of his deep views about the world. To make America first or great again, we have to not be ripped off by allies or competitors. Now, on the trade issue, the original dream was the WTO system would be where the Europeans and America could unite to focus on Chinese violations. And here, our ambassador to the WTO, he used to be at the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, Patrick. He's made a number of really quite marvelous presentations to what they call the General Council of the WTO, in which he's seeking and getting European support. CNN should report this. Basically, he's one of his most brilliant formulations. He said, you Chinese say a lot that you're reforming. It's not true. Everything you talk about in terms of reforms is perfecting state capitalism. And you promised when you joined the WTO that you'd give up state capitalism. So there's an effort by President Trump to reform the WTO, or if necessary, to supersede it. But we have the support of the Europeans on some of these issues at the WTO. That's a very good thing. But I think what you're reflecting is a really widespread criticism of President Trump, that he doesn't work with allies and partners enough on China or on other issues too. And I can only say he formed these views 30 years ago, that we should not be ripped off by allies.
Well, I'll say that there are a lot of debates over that issue, but it's also part of just in think tanks like this, where those think through strategies.
I think he likes Boris Johnson a lot, though.
Different strategies of how to have and wield influence. All right, let's take some questions. Sir, over on the end, and we have a mic. And if you don't mind, please introduce yourself.
Richard Tuning is my name. This is a question for Dr. Pillsbury. You mentioned that no president has reversed the Carter order to cooperate with China. Since you're an advisor
He's
to
not reversed it.
has not.
Yeah.
Since you're an advisor to President Trump, have you advised President Trump to do so? And if not, why hasn't he?
To quote Bob Mueller, I'm not going to answer that question.
That's not in your purview, I think, is the.
Okay.
It's quite an answer.
Let's go back here. I'm going to move around. The gentleman right there, if we could get a mic. Yes.
Hi, my name's Patrick McGlinchey. My question has to do with the trilateral talks.
Do you have an affiliation or?
I'm a student at Georgetown University
Okay,
here.
great. Thank you.
So my question has to do with the trilateral arms control talks. So you discussed the strategic competition, especially in emerging technologies like hypersonic missiles, but the Chinese argument on this is, hey, look, our arsenal is a fraction of yours.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
U.S. and Russia. So my
That
question
is the Chinese argument.
So what can we do to incentivize them to come to the table on this issue, or can we?
Okay. Both of you have a response to that. Do you want to go
Yes,
first?
well, I'm a historian. I mean, my 100-year marathon is a history. If you look back at the history, how did the Soviet-American arms control talks begin? It wasn't just snapping your fingers and we'll meet you in Geneva and do a treaty to cap nuclear weapons and missiles. It didn't happen that way at all. It happened in a very indirect way with something called the Pugwash or the Dartmouth talks, the framing by scientists of who would have incentives. You use the word to incentivize the Chinese. What incentives would they have to show up in trilateral arms control talks? That's the focus of my own thinking right now about Chinese hawks and doves and how they debate it. The doves would say, or the moderates would say, here's our incentives. We need to cap the Americans and possibly the Russians from getting more threatening to us. In return, we get to freeze our current deployments. That's credible to the hawks in Beijing only if they believe that both the Russians and the Americans are going to increase their deployments and their weapons against China. I think to some degree the hawks in China believe that. I believe they say the American goal toward China is absolute superiority. 绝对优势, as some Mandarin speakers in the audience. Absolute superiority, as China defines it, is we'll be able to destroy, remember that 6 a.m. in the morning satellite attack? The likely American response would be the destruction in one day of the entire Chinese second strike force. It's very concentrated. It's not spread out all over the country. The silos aren't that hardened. It's feasible, some Chinese think. So would they like to see the Americans greatly increase deployments of all types? Submarines, counter space weapons. There's quite a long list the Chinese hawks are worried about. Yes, they'd like to see that capped. They'd like to see a treaty where the Americans can't get any worse in terms of being a military threat to China.
Jim, do you have a comment on
I
this
mean, I couldn't
question?
answer, but the only thing I would say is that the Chinese approach is reminiscent of the approach even to sort of trade agreements. Is we are just a small country. You know, you are so far ahead of us. You know, we can't agree. We can't agree. Just don't mind us while we continue on what is a pretty remarkable and rapid military advance.
One of their most humorous responses, I've heard this from Chinese generals directly, they say, well, arms control talks, China does not want them because they only existed because of the Cold War between you and the Soviets. So if we have arms control talks between America and China, this will bring back the Cold War. And I had to kind of scratch my head about the logic.
You had a question here. You had your hand up for a while, and we're moving around the room.
Thank you very much. I'm Raghuveer Goyal. I'm a journalist in Washington covering the White House, Pentagon, and State Department with India, Globe, and Asia Today. This is a very timely event because so much going on between US and Russia and China. And Jim, great book, timely book. I know him for a long time, of course, being a journalist covering and working with him. My question is that for the last 25 years, I have been saying two things at the White House, State Department, Pentagon. That Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan. Nobody believed, but finally, President Obama, his administration came to conclusion and he was found in Pakistan. And the entire White House courts also agree with me. Same thing I was saying about China, that China one day will be challenged and danger to the US and stealing all the US secrets. So can I ask you, both of you, that who's danger more to the US, Russia or China, and to the regional nations?
Okay.
In the, thank
All
you.
right. Thank you for your question. So the question is,
Who's more dangerous?
who's
Yeah.
correct?
I've seen the president has called on you. In a press
Yes, he
conference.
has. Yes.
I see him every day.
Jim, do you
So-
want to go first?
My view, and this is the view of the much smarter people I spoke with for my book, is that Russia is the greater, more dangerous short-term threat, declining power, perhaps somewhat less predictable, but China is by far the greater long-term and true challenger to America's position and dominance as the dominant world power. You agree with that?
Yes, as Mueller would say, generally. I'm surprised you didn't ask about India. India can be a much greater help to us with China than with Russia. Where the United States is going to need allies and partners the most is not with Russia. We already have NATO alliance. The Warsaw Pact is gone. So we have an automatic superiority with our NATO allies. With China, we have no alliances against China. In 1947, when the Cold War began, a law was passed that created, think about this, for China as a challenge. With the Soviet Union, one law created CIA, National Security Council, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and an agenda for what the United States government should do about a major challenge. We have none of that with China. What we do have is impatient kind of nudging from India. Why don't you do something about China? And this came to a head in the summer of 2017 when this weird column of Chinese forces and bulldozers began to move toward Bhutan, and the Indian army deployed and said, you can't do this, kind of protecting Bhutanese territory, which the Bhutanese were a little bit unsure about whether they wanted to go that far. And we helped a little bit with India. But here was a nation that was threatened by Chinese military forces. Yes, very small, but still, it was happening. And it reminded me at the time, and I still think this, with Russia we have such an array of organizations and the experience of the Cold War where it turned out for the best. We won, basically, to quote President Reagan. But with China, we don't have the machinery, we don't have the treaties, we don't have allies and partners. So I'm much more concerned about the China threat, your question, which is like the worst threat. We're prepared for Russia to a much greater degree than we are for the challenge from our Chinese friends.
We're going to catch this side of the room, and we'll come back here in front, because I know you've had your hand up for a while. Sir, why don't we catch both of your questions? If you don't mind, we'll take two of them, and since you're right together there, okay? Please.
Thank you. Question for Dr. Pillsbury.
Will you introduce yourself?
Tim Nelson, State Department.
Thank
Wonder if you could comment on one measure of China's power is its ability to keep every single leader of the world silent on the concentration camps in Xinjiang, where it holds over 3 million people. When the world said never again, our actions have been silenced. Would you recommend the president to use the Magnitsky Act to appoint a special envoy for Xinjiang, to separate the West from providing the type of technology that Xinjiang shows China's view of what the future of technology use against humans should be? What actions would you recommend for the president?
Thank you for the question, and sir, if we could take yours too.
Thank you. This is a really terrific discussion. My name is Pat Malloy. I'm a trade lawyer around town, but I was on the China Commission when we first got going, and Michael was a great help to us as we started out. He mentioned Dennis Shea, who is our ambassador to the WTO. Dennis is terrific because he's not only a good trade lawyer, but he worked up in the Hill on the Senate for many years and then chaired the China Commission for at least 2 times. Mike Esper, our new Secretary of Defense, is also an alumnus of the China Commission. So this has been an enormously important organization, because if you look back on 20 years of their reports, they've been pretty accurate about what was really going on here. Now, what I saw, and I want to just ask the two gentlemen, here's what I see. Trump won the last election because he won Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I grew up in Pennsylvania. We've lost 50,000 factories from America to China over the last 20 years. Those have been enormous impact on the communities and small towns all over those industrial states. That's one of the reasons Trump won the election. What I see going on is when Trump was going in May, and they were going to look like they were going to get an agreement, you'll see that Schumer, Trumka, Marco Rubio, many others on the Hill were warning Trump not to make a bad deal. So I see that there's a political problem, and I wanted to get your two. Trump is stuck on not making a bad deal, because if he does, it's going to hurt him in those key industrial states on his reelection.
All right, we'll get their reaction. Shall we begin? You want to
Listen,
begin first?
Politically, I would just make this point. This is why folks like Jack Ma make this prediction that this is a decades-long trade war, is that politically, let's say Trump loses in 2020, does a Democratic president weaken the U.S. stance towards China's trade malpractice? No. You lose those voters there and elsewhere, so that you have really a bipartisan, kind of reordering of the way, maybe not to the same degree or in the same way that Trump does it, but that from a political standpoint, you have both parties with an incentive to stick to that. That's one point I would make on that. I mean, just to your point, I know you didn't ask me the question. I did actually ask in the closed session, I asked Dr. Pillsbury this question: well, why not make human rights part of the broader strategy, in approaching China, not just trade? Diplomat secretary here made the point that China, and that's been my experience, respects when you stick to your values and don't back down on your own values. And I'll just share a personal experience. When I was in Beijing was when the blind dissident Chen Guangchen was accepted into the embassy, and I remember the deep debate within the State Department, the administration. There were some, Hillary Clinton, to her credit, who said bring him in, and there were some who were immediately calculating how to get him out because they were worried about the broader relationship. But part of the debate was what's more important to us, but also wasn't discussed enough was why do we care if this is important to us in its own right, and why are we backing away from that? That's just my point on that. But anyway, your turn.
Both questions have kind of a common answer. I think it's important to understand that the goodwill toward China is still very strong in the United States and in the State Department and around the world. The notion that China is some kind of a bad country or Nazi Germany, no, this is a very small number of people think this way. Generally speaking, worldwide, if you look at the various polls and various indicators, you can find a lot of anti-Americanism greater than the anti-China sentiments. So notions that America should do something about human rights in Xinjiang, or that we should have a really killer deal in trade with China that satisfies Marco Rubio and Sherrod Brown and so forth. We're dealing from a position of weakness toward China. People don't understand this. Goodwill and favorable feelings and a good perception of China, this is really, really strong in our country and around the world. The cooperation that Jimmy Carter authorized continues. It hasn't been stopped. One tiny little change was made 2 years ago when the National Science Foundation office in Beijing, the channel for transferring all American scientific discoveries quickly to China, that office was shut down. There's a huge outcry from American scientists. How can you shut down the National Science Foundation office in Beijing. Don't you want to work on finding a cure for cancer and, use Chinese data? Besides, all scientific discoveries eventually spread anyway around the world. It's a huge outcry. Right now, there's a big battle involving NASA. Some people at NASA say we should help the Chinese rabbit on the far side of the moon relay their transmissions so we can all understand better lunar dust being kicked up. Because when Neil Armstrong stepped down, there was dust. Not as much as he expected, he says in his first recording. But it's an interesting problem. So let's relay Chinese transmissions, NASA says. The Space Council in the White House, Scott Pace, on the record, the executive director, said there shall be no cooperation between the Chinese space program and the American space program because of lack of trust. Now, this is two different policy views. My guess, the NASA view to work with China and even provide them advanced space technology, that view is going to win. Frank Wolf is long gone. He legislated a 1-year moratorium on even talks with NASA. But these nitty-gritty questions of how the 50 agencies at the embassy in Beijing conduct business with the Chinese, it remains on the cooperative side. So don't delude yourselves into thinking that the whole world thinks that China is a big problem and we have to take a tough stand, or we should be sad if leaders are silent. They're silent because they respect Chinese power, and they know that China punishes people inside countries who speak out against China, denies them visa, denies them billion-dollar contracts. Do we do anything like that? No. We open our borders to Chinese reporters without conditions.
We like to respect everyone's time. We're going to take your question, and we'll take your question, the young lady back there. So these two, and we'll close. If you'll introduce yourself, and also if we'll get her a mic. So we get two of them, and then we're going to close. Okay? Please, introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Brian Freidenborg. Pardon the appearance. I just found out about this when I was out, but I'm a freelance journalist, realcontextnews.com, if anyone's interested. First, on a personal note, I just want to say, Jim, you're one of the finest reporters we have out there at a time when we really need this kind of reporting, so thank you. Please keep doing what you're doing. My question to both of you is, I'd love to hear your response to this issue as I frame it, and the way I see it, we're in the Atlantic Council, which is associated with NATO, one of the most hallowed institutions in the history of the world in terms of advancing peace. We are thinking about these issues in this institutional mindset where we have certain paradigms, decades of policy, decades of institutions, everything's been thought of and sort of approached more or less, even in a bipartisan sense, from a certain angle. And we're talking about U.S. policy towards China. And
So
I
your
feel
question
like,
is-
yes, so the question is, I feel like we don't have a policy anymore in the sense that we have Pierre Navarro, Trump is tough on trade talks, and then at the same time we withdraw from TPP, which is the single biggest help the Chinese have had with one act in generations that hurt us. So we look at Donald Trump, we look at where we are right now, where does Mike Pompeo or Rex Tillerson speak for the United States? Does Donald Trump speak for himself when he changes his mind constantly? And I'm worried that the Chinese have this policy and
So
that
your
we do
question
not.
is- I think the
And
question
what's
is,
new-
you
well,
want
what's your
them
reaction to
react
the
what
idea
policy
that
is.
with that framing we don't have
Right.
Okay, then we'll get your response to what you see as U.S. policy. And
Okay.
Yes, ma'am, you
Hi,
have the
thank
last
you.
question. We'll get both.
Okay,
and
Chia
close.
Ching with United Day News Group Taiwan. I have a question for Dr. Pillsbury. If you can you hear me?
We can
Okay.
hear you fine.
Okay, good. So you mentioned a couple of reasons why you think that Mr. President Trump does not see China as an enemy. One is that he didn't or hasn't sell F-16s to Taiwan. But if you read Congressman Michael McCall's piece on The Diplomat yesterday, he expects that Congress will receive a formal notification soon. So does that mean President Trump is now seeing China as an enemy if he sells F-16 to Taiwan? Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Want to start with that, or start with, it's up to you? Why don't you start with that, and I'll
On
do
your
this.
question,
Okay.
I again go back to Mr. Mueller's response. This is another one. Your question is not within my purview.
Okay, Taiwan. Taiwan.
No,
She directed that to
the
you.
sale of F-16s to Taiwan, I think, has not gone through. And I don't think President Trump sees China as an enemy. I do think the reason that I was on the transition team in an emergency because President-elect Trump had taken a phone call from Tsai Ing-wen and told the press she was the president of Taiwan. And China was very upset that this attacks the foundation of the One China principle, that as far back as Nixon's agreement, Taiwan is not a country. It's not a nation. We have no diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And we certainly don't respect, or we don't recognize any president of Taiwan. President Trump has stuck to this view. He stated his One China policy in a phone call with President Xi. So I don't see the idea of China as an enemy that these China experts on July 3rd in their letter, they're trying to say, you're treating China as an enemy, please stop. I just don't see that as happening. And one of the best explanations for it is that President Trump has not done a lot to help Taiwan the way so many conservatives wanted him to. See what I mean?
Okay.
So there's a long list of policies President Trump has not adopted that would upset or anger China.
Okay. All right.
And I'm not just texting pals. I have a meeting on the Hill I have to go to, which I've been pushing up, but I'm going to be very brief. Alliances. Final chapter of the book. The one unanimous strategic response to the Russian and China challenges here, and this is from Democrats, Republicans, sub-commanders, top NSA, Ops Center operators, diplomats, etc., is we're stronger with alliances. NATO, even trade agreements like a TPP, where they're responding to China and Russia, and that's a part of the administration's approach that I would love to speak to the president about. Why doesn't he calculate it's in his interest to work with them, whether you're challenging trade issues or military issues? That's the way I'd answer that. The final point I would make, I was realizing as I was sitting on this podium that the last time I was here, I had the honor of sitting next to Senator John McCain, and we were talking about NATO, and he was making a very similar point. As I was talking to you, I had this kind of memory of
Deja vu.
that, the late John McCain. But,
Congratulations to you on your book.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your forthcoming book, and really thank you both
Thanks
for
for
coming
sharing the
today.
podium.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. And
Apologies
you probably
for
have to
I
zip.
literally